Next, we're going to move on to the header actions, where we're going to create and style these buttons along with the tooltips that are displayed on hover. Okay, first let's analyze this. As always, for better code structure, we'll put all the header actions inside a container element to treat it as a single component. These header actions look similar to me. They are a bunch of buttons with tooltips, and the last action toggles the profile menu. So I suggest that we put them all in an unordered list, where each action will be a list item. This way we'll make our code more restrictive and predictable. Okay, let's go to our index file to see what HTML we already have here. This is a dummy div that we put here earlier as a placeholder. Let's change it to an unordered list here and also here. Then we'll remove this text and add our first list item for this header action. Let's also add a class here right away for us to easily target this from our CSS code. And we'll call it header action. Next, let's add a button inside this list item with some dummy text, say button, or maybe action 1. And let's see how this looks on our page. Good, that's a start. Okay, notice that every header action on the reference page is an image. So let's replace the text inside our button with this image. For that, I'm going to save the image inside the icons folder because the image looks like an icon to me. And then in our HTML code, I'm going to remove this text and add an image element, and the source attribute will be, okay, let's see. We've got images and then icons, and I believe the icon we just saved is advertise.svg. So I'll write images, icons, and then advertise svg. And great. Next, let's reset the default list styles and hide the bullet and also remove the padding. You can pause the video and do this yourself first for more practice, or you can follow along. Okay. To reset the default list styles, we need to create a rule for the list itself. So I'm going to copy its class name, and then we'll add our rule inside the header.css file and not inside the search.css file, because our header actions are not related to the search, but they are related to the header. So we'll target our list by its class name, and to remove the bullets, we'll set its list style property to none, and we'll also reset its padding to 0 and margin as well. And this will look like this on our page. Great. Next, let's remove these default button styles as well. Okay, our button, this button doesn't have a class. So we can use a combinator and target it starting from the list item. Or we can add a class to the button and target it directly by its class name. Let's use the child combinator for more practice here, since we're using classes all the time anyway. So it'll be a class selector, then a child combinator, and then a tag selector. Let's copy this class name and start our selector by targeting this class. Then we'll use the child combinator and then a tag selector to target the button. So this child combinator ensures that we're targeting only the button elements that are direct children of the elements with the header action class. And for these buttons, which is this button, we want to remove the border and the gray background. To remove the border, I'm going to write border and then none, and it's going to look like this. And to remove the gray background, I'm going to write background color and then transparent to make the background color completely invisible. And this will look like this. Great. Now let's make our button look like this on hover. You already saw how to do this when we created the remove button in the search dropdown. Here it's similar, but with important differences. Notice that when we click on the button here, the background becomes transparent again, instead of becoming slightly darker as it was here. Next, the size of the images is different here, but the gray background circle is the same size for each button. And because of these differences, we're going to use a different approach here. We'll use a fixed width and height. You already know everything you need to style this hover and click behavior for these buttons. So if you want a challenge, I'm going to ask you to pause this video and try to add these styles yourself. Style only the buttons. You don't need to create these tooltips or this notification count or this online indicator element. And I would encourage you to do this exercise because it will be really good for building your CSS skills. Now let's add these styles together. First, we'll need to explicitly set the width and height of our buttons to keep their background the same size. And let's see what those are. So it's 40 by 40. Okay, so we'll add width, 40 pixels here, and also height, 40 pixels here, because this rule targets our action buttons. And reload the page. No major changes, only our button was shifted slightly to the left. But let's inspect our button to check if our styles were applied correctly. Okay, I can see the width and height here, so they are applied, great. And if I go to the Computed tab to check the box model, what I see here is that the content dimensions are not 40 by 40, which is weird, right? Because we set these to be 40 by 40 explicitly. I also notice here this vertical and horizontal paddings. And what's interesting here is that if we add the horizontal paddings, so 6 plus 6 is 12, and the content width, 12 plus 28 is 40, which is the exact value that we set for our width here. And also, if we add the vertical padding and the content height here, so 1 plus 1, 2, and 2 plus 38 is 40, which is, again, the height that we set in our CSS code. So it seems that for some strange reason, the width and height here is padding plus the content size. But why is that? Well, this is because in CSS, we can control how our width and height values are distributed within an element. There is a special CSS property called box sizing that controls whether we include padding, like here, when we set our width and height. And for our buttons, the property box sizing is set to border box, which means include padding and border in the width and height value. This value is fine for our purposes because the background we add to our buttons next will also be behind padding. But if we want our width and height properties to affect only the content size, we can either remove padding or change the box sizing value to content box. Let's remove the padding because it requires less changes here, but if you're curious, try changing the box sizing value to content box and see what happens. Okay, and to remove this padding, I'm gonna add padding 0 here and reload our page. Notice that now that there is no padding here, the size of the content is exactly 40 by 40 pixels. Next, for our button, we're gonna make the background color change to this one, like here, and also turn the cursor into a pointer. And for that, let's emulate the hover state for the button and make sure that the right button is selected in the DOM tree here. Then let's copy the background color here. And in our code, we'll add a new rule that targets our buttons like this, and we want to target the hover state here. And on hover, we want to set the background color property to the value we just copied, and also cursor to a pointer. Go to our page, reload, and perfect. Okay, and this is a square on hover, but we want it to be a circle like this. So I would ask you to pause this video and make this a circle. Okay, we already know that we can use the border radius property and set its value to 50% to make it a circle. And because by default the background color of these buttons is transparent, it actually doesn't matter where we put the border radius property. So we can add it in this CSS rule or in this CSS rule. Let's add it here. So border radius and then 50%. And this will look like this. Fantastic. Okay, notice that the image inside the button is already vertically and horizontally centered. This is because images behave in many ways like text in CSS, and text in buttons is vertically and horizontally centered by default. And if you want to place an image or text inside a button in a different way, you can use flexbox, positioning, or paddings. But for our purposes, this default behavior is fine. Next, let's handle the active state of the button here. Okay, so when we click the button, we need to make its background color transparent. And to do that, let's add another rule that targets the active state of the button. And here we want to change the background color to transparent, just like we do this here. Okay, and if we reload our page, hover over the button and click it, there you go. Now it's transparent. Perfect. I think this button is ready, so let's add these remaining buttons. And we'll add just the buttons without these tooltips or these indicators. So pause the video, download these images from this reference page, then just duplicate this HTML of the first button 4 times, one for each button, and then update the src attribute for each button to show the right icon. And I'm going to do this as well, but I'll speed up the video. Also make sure that you use the .png file extension for the avatar and not the SVG like with the rest of the icons. If you use the SVG here, this image will not be loaded. And reload the page. Okay, this doesn't look good. This is because we need to handle a few things here. First of all, this avatar image is too big and we need to make it smaller. So let's get the correct size from the reference page, and it's 32 by 32. And notice that this image is a square, which means that we can set only the width. And its height will be adjusted automatically. Now to target specifically the avatar image and not the rest, let's add a class here. It's going to be header action avatar. And then we'll copy the class and add a new CSS rule that targets the class. And remember that we want to set the width to 32 pixels. So let's write width 32 pixels here, reload the page. Great. Now the image has the right size, and let's make it a circle. And that should be easy, right? We just need to use the border radius property and set it to 50%. Great. Next, let's position our header actions horizontally, and for that, we can make their parent, which is this UL element, a flex container, because each header action is an LI element here. The UL element has this class, so let's copy the class, and in VS Code, I think we already have a rule that targets the class. And to find the rule, let's search in the class, and we'll use a keyboard shortcut, Command F for Mac, and I'll paste the class, and there is the rule. we want to make it a flex container. So for that, we'll write display flex. Now let's reload the page. Great. This is what we want. All header actions are here and they look pretty good. And now that these buttons are all in place, let's add these two indicators. We'll start with this notification counter. And notice that it overlaps the button, so it's going to be a good place to use CSS positioning. As you probably remember from previous tutorials, we can use different types of positioning to move our elements anywhere we want on our page without interfering with other elements. And we discussed the relative, absolute, and fixed types of positioning. So again, as a challenge, think of what type of positioning would you use to create this indicator here. And maybe, if you feel confident enough, try to create this notification indicator yourself first. As always, it's going to be awesome for building your CSS skills. But if you don't feel confident enough, don't worry, we're going to create this indicator together. Our plan will be the following. We'll add HTML code for this indicator, then we'll style it, and then we'll position it properly. Now, what HTML code do we need to add here? Well, there is this number that reflects how many unread notifications we have. And we can add this number just as text in our HTML code and then make it white. Then this text is inside this red circle, which can be a simple div element that contains the text and also has background color and uses the border radius property to turn a square into a circle. This means that what we can do is we can find the open inbox button, and inside the button element after the image, we can add a div that contains number 1. Let's also assign a class to this div. We'll name it notification counter. And if we reload our page, there it is. For now, it's just a regular black text on a separate line, because div is a block element. Now let's add the red background and set the text color to white. So I'm going to get the background color value. Okay, it's red. So let's copy the class name, and inside the header file, we'll add another CSS rule, background color red and text, and color white. And this will look like this. Okay, that's a start, but we're going to make it so much better. First, let's make it a circle. Notice that at the moment, the div is a rectangle and not a square. And it's a rectangle because it's a block element, and by default, block elements take up all the horizontal space available in their parent. Now, we haven't tried setting border width to 50% for rectangular elements. So let's see what happens if we do this for this element. And here I'm going to write border radius 50%, reload the page. Well, it looks like a squished circle. And to make it a proper circle, we need to make sure that its width and height values are the same. So let's get these from the reference page, and they are 16 by 16. So let's add these width 16 pixels and height 16 pixels as well. Reload the page. There you go. Now it's a circle. Next, let's adjust the size of the text inside the div, because on the reference page, the number looks noticeably smaller. And as you know, there are several ways to get the font size. Let's inspect the element, and under the Computed tab, we'll filter by the font size. And here we can see that we need to set the font size to 10 pixels. So let's do this, font size 10 pixels, and this will look like this on our page. Okay, this is nice, and now let's center the number vertically and horizontally inside the circle. For that, we'll use flexbox. So I'm going to write display flex here to make it a flex container. then justify content center to center the text horizontally, and then align items center to center it vertically. And there you go. Now it's centered perfectly. Next, we will position this counter in the top right corner, just like here. And for that, we're going to use CSS positioning. What we want to do here is position this indicator relative to the inbox button. And so we'll use the absolute position on the indicator to be able to move it around. And then we want to use the relative position on the inbox button, which is the parent of the indicator, so that the absolute position of the indicator works relative to the inbox button and not the whole page itself. Okay, first let's assign the relative position to the inbox button. For that, let's inspect the button to figure out how we can target it from our CSS code. Because the button or its parent don't have any unique class name or ID that we can use to narrow our CSS selector down to target specifically this button. So to target the button, let's assign it a class. For that, I'm going to go to our index.html and write class, and let's call it inbox button. Now we can use this class in our CSS code. So let's add a new rule and target the button. And remember that we want to set the relative position here like this. Because again, with this, we can change the position of the notification counter to absolute and move it relative to the inbox button. So let's do that and write position absolute here. And this is going to look like this on the page, where now the inbox button is in its normal place because the counter is absolutely positioned and on its own layer, and it doesn't interfere with other elements on the page. So it's like this indicator does not exist for this button. Next, let's move this indicator to the top right corner here. For that, we can use the top and right properties that we unlocked when we applied the absolute position. So let's start from something and right here, top 0 and right 0. And okay, this is a start. Now it's exactly in the top right corner. And next we're going to get and set the exact values to position it like here. So I'll inspect the indicator here and then go to the Styles tab. And here you can see that we need to set the top to 4 pixels, and we can leave the right property at 0 pixels. So 4 pixels here, and perfect. And this is it. I think we have completed the unread notifications indicator. And next, for you to have more practice, I'm going to ask you to pause the video and style this green online indicator. It's going to be quite similar to what we did with the notifications indicator, just with some minor changes. You'll need to use the bottom property instead of the top property to position it in the bottom right corner. You'll also use the green color for the background that you can get by inspecting this indicator from here. Also notice that it has this 1 pixel solid white border around it, which shouldn't be a problem for you to add because we've done this many times before. Also notice that the indicator is not an image. It's a div with fixed width and height, and also a green background, and it's a circle because of the border radius property. So now pause this video and style this indicator. And I'm going to speed up the video to save us some time. And if you get stuck, you can always inspect the reference page to see the solution or use the link to the code solution from the description. Great. Now that we've created all these header actions, let's add these tooltips. And by a tooltip, I mean this white text on the black background that appears when we hover over a button. And remember that this tooltip is displayed all the time because we emulated the hover state on the advertise button. And the good news is that you already know pretty much everything you need to create these tooltips. And so again, I would encourage you to go ahead and try coding them yourself first. But there are a few things where you might get stuck. For example, how do we make these tooltips appear on hover? To solve this, we can use a child combinator similar to how we solved this for the search, where we show the drop-down when we click on the input. Another tricky place can be the profile menu button, where the tooltip is further to the left to stay on the screen. And we can solve this by adding another class to the tooltip and adjusting the position from the right. Remember that we can add more than one class to any HTML element and then target them separately from CSS. Or we could add a unique class to this button and then target the tooltip using the descendant combinator. Okay, pause this video and try to code these tooltips. And now let's code these together. Okay, we already have the hover state emulated for the advertise button, which makes it easier for us to work with its tooltip. So let's look at the tooltip and think what we need to do to create it. First of all, we'll need a container element like a div where we'll put this text and this gray background. The tooltip appears below the header border and above this image, but it doesn't push them anywhere, which means we need to use some kind of positioning here. And most likely it's going to be absolute positioning. Just as with these indicators, I think it's going to be really convenient to position the tooltip relative to the button it's associated with. Which means that just with the indicators, we'll need to put the HTML of the tooltip inside the corresponding button and then make sure that all these buttons with the tooltips have the relative position assigned to them in our CSS. Okay, I think we have a good initial plan, so let's start creating all this. I'm gonna inspect this tooltip and copy the text because I'm a little bit lazy to type it all in. And next in our code, let's find the advertise button. There it is. And then we'll add the tooltip div inside the button. And I'll paste the text here. It doesn't matter whether the div is after the image or before the image, but for me, it makes more sense to put it after the image because I think of the image as the primary content of the button and the tooltip as the secondary content, because it's visible only under certain conditions. Let's also add a class to this div so that we can easily target it from our CSS code. Let's name it header action tooltip. And then we'll change the position of our tooltip. So here in our CSS, we'll change the position to absolute. And reload our page. Okay, there it is, our absolutely positioned div. Next, let's add all the easy styles. I mean, the text color, background color, padding, font size, and also border radius. At this point, it should be really easy for you to add all those. So I'm going to speed up the video to get to more fun stuff. Okay, and this is what you should have by now. And now let's get to the fun stuff and position it properly. Okay, notice that each tooltip appears under its corresponding button. And if, for example, we move these buttons to a different place on the page, we'd like their tooltips to move along with the buttons. And you already know that for that, we can assign a relative position to each of these buttons. And I think that we already have a rule that targets our buttons. And there it is. So let's extend this rule and write position relative here. Now, since this changes position to relative for every header action button, these two rules are redundant because they are doing the same but for these two buttons. So we can just remove them to make our code less cluttered. Okay, and if I reload the code, Nothing changed for these indicators, which means that the rule works. And now all these buttons have the relative position. Notice that the tooltip text is now placed on 3 lines. This is because we changed the tooltip's position to absolute, and because of that, now it wants to be as wide as its relatively positioned parent button. But the current width of the button is not enough to fit all the tooltip's text on one line. And so the browser puts the text on separate lines to make the width of the tooltip as close as possible to the width of the button. This is how it works by default, but we want this text to be on one line. And we're going to use a new CSS property to achieve this. Let's go to VS Code, and inside this rule that targets the tooltip container, we will write white space, no wrap, like this. And this tells the browser that we don't want to break up our text into individual words like here to put these on separate lines when there is not enough horizontal space. And so now if I reload the page, there you go. Our tooltip text is on one line. So use white space no wrap when you want to force your text to stay on the same line. Okay, next, let's place the tooltip in the correct position under the button. And we want it to be slightly below the button. And we also want the center of the tooltip to be aligned with the center of the button, like this. Okay, so first, let's position the tooltip slightly below the button. And if we look closely, notice that the tooltip starts right after the header bottom border. We'll use this as a marker that we positioned our tooltip properly. Remember that we applied the absolute position to our tooltip, so this means that we can use the top and bottom properties to move our tooltip down. And because this tooltip is inside the button with the relative position, I mean with position relative, if we use the top property on the tooltip, so if we write something like top, let's say 0, then because of this, the tooltip will start right where the top edge of the button is. And if we use the bottom property here instead, so with bottom 0, with this, our tooltip bottom edge will be right where the button's bottom edge is. And so if we use the bottom property to move the tooltip down, we're going to need to use negative values like this. And notice that as I decrease the bottom property value, the tooltip moves down. So we can use either the top or the bottom properties. And how would I decide which one to use? And so in this specific case, I would use the top property. And then I would increase its value until the tooltip reaches the border. Remember that we need our tooltip to be just below the bottom border of the header. So this is a proper position, which means that the 49 pixels is the value that we're going to set in our style sheet like this. And okay. And the reason why I would use the top property and not the bottom in this specific case is because I know that the height of its parent, which is this button, the height of this button is fixed. And because with the top property, we start at the top edge of the button and the button's height is fixed, this means that this distance will less likely to be changed in the future than, for example, the font size of the tooltip's text, or maybe its padding, and those influence the height of the tooltip. And if we use the bottom property and the height of the tooltip changed, then we'd need to update the bottom property every time that happens. Otherwise, the tooltip will be in the wrong place. So in this specific case, if we use the top property to position our tooltip, we make our tooltip slightly more resilient to changes. Next, let's align the center of the tooltip with the center of the button, like here. And this might seem a little tricky, but I think it's an interesting and useful approach to learn. We will achieve this in 2 steps. Notice that right now, the left edge of the tooltip is exactly where the left edge of the button is. And so the first step will be to make our tooltip start where the middle of the button is. So we want our tooltip to start here. For that, we can use the left property. And because our tooltip is absolutely positioned, we can use the left property to move the tooltip to the right. And so let's write left and then 50. And then instead of pixels, let's write here %. And if we reload our page, now the tooltip starts right where the middle of its parent button is. When we write it like this, it means move this element 50% of the width of my parent, which is the parent of this tooltip is this button. So move me 50% of the width of my parent. And so now the left edge of the tooltip is aligned with the center of this button. And we want to align not the left edge, but the center of the tooltip with the center of the button. So let's move on to the step 2 of achieving that. Okay, so if we start from the left edge of the tooltip and go 50% of its width to the right, we'll end up right at its center. This means that if we somehow would be able to move the tooltip 50% of its width to the left, its center would be perfectly aligned with the center of the button. So how could we do that? First of all, we cannot touch this property because otherwise would break what we achieved in the first step. And so here we'll use another property that you're already familiar from our previous tutorials, and it's called transform. And remember that to move our element horizontally, we need to use a special function here called translate x. And inside the parentheses, we can use a value in pixels. So for example, if we write here 10 pixels and reload our page, the tooltip has been moved 10 pixels to the right from its initial position. And we can use negative values like this to move it to the left. And so here we can use a value in pixels, or we can use a value in %. And if we use % here, then this distance will be based on the width of this element. And so translate x negative 10% means move the tooltip to the left, and the distance this is moved to the left is 10% of the width of the tooltip. So if we want this tooltip to be moved 50% of its width to the left, we can just write here 50% instead of 10. And if I reload the page, this is exactly what we wanted. Now their centers are aligned. And what's great about using % here and not pixels, with % we can change the amount of text in the tooltip. So let's change it to something like this. And the tooltip will still be perfectly aligned with the button. And this is great because notice that each of these tooltips has a different amount of text. Great. Now that we've positioned the tooltip properly, let's change our CSS to show the tooltip only when we hover over the button. For that, we'll change this rule to hide the tooltip by default, so display none. And this will make the tooltip stay hidden. And next, let's show the tooltip when we hover over the button. For this, we'll use a clever way of combining CSS selector with pseudo-classes and combinators. First of all, notice that our button doesn't have a class, but its parent does have this class. And so to target the button, let's start our selector from targeting its parent. And then we'll use a child combinator to target the button. So let's add a new CSS role. And here we are targeting the parent of the button, and then a child combinator, and then button. And you already know what this selector means. it means target only the button HTML elements that are direct children of the elements that have the header action class. And we want to target only the hover state of the button. And when the button is in the hover state, we want to target its tooltip. And notice that the tooltip is nested inside the button, so it's its child. And because this tooltip is nested inside the button, we can target the tooltip and add here a space, and then target the tooltip by its class name, and then apply some styles here. Remember that this is a descendant combinator, which means that this must be somewhere inside this. And while this might look complicated to you at the moment, in a couple of moments you'll see that it's actually not. So first of all, this is a valid CSS selector, and what it means is that we want to target this element only when this button is in the hover state. And also the button must be a direct child of this element, and that this must be nested somewhere inside this button. I mean, because of this element must be a child of the button, but not necessarily its direct child. And so only when the button is in the hover state, we want to target this element, which is our tooltip, and then apply the styles that we're going to write. And remember that we want to show the tooltip when the button is in the hover state. So for that, we can simply write display block. And now I'll reload the page. The tooltip is hidden by default. And if I hover over the button, the tooltip is visible. Awesome. And this is how you create the tooltips that appear on hover. What's cool about our tooltip is that now we can easily add it to the remaining buttons. So for example, if we want a tooltip for this button, all we have to do is to find this HTML, copy it, then paste inside the button, and just change the text here, which should be open chat. So open chat, lowercase chat. And voila! Now we've got two tooltips. And also notice that it's also positioned correctly because we used the relative positioning with relative values in percents here and here, instead of hard-coded values in pixels. And this is why. Next, let's quickly add the rest of the tooltips. And I'm going to speed up the video because it will be just copy-pasting and changing the text. And great, 3 more tooltips. Okay, and these two are fine, but I don't like where this one is, because notice that it goes beyond the screen. And to fix this, we can align it not with the center of the button, but align its right side with the right side of the button, which is easier than it sounds. And we'll do this in the next video. And also we'll learn a pretty cool trick how to add this toggle behavior to show and hide the profile menu when we click on the avatar without using JavaScript. So it's going to be just HTML and CSS. And I'm going to add the link here when it's ready.